We are going to begin a new series today. We wrestled a bit with what we should look at as a church, what the main text we should use is, whether we should carry on what we were doing, and we talked about that as a leadership, and it'd be fair to say there was a bit of discussion back and forward. But the main thing, or what we came to the conclusion of, is actually this is a peculiar moment, and it's absolutely worth us making a decision that, you know what, the important thing is that we embrace this moment and speak to this moment. So we're going to do a series in the book of Psalms over the next little while. Normally when I start a series, I know exactly how long it's going to be. It's going to be 6 weeks or 8 weeks, and this way I have no idea. What I will promise you is I'm not planning to go from Psalm 1 to Psalm 150, and we'll be here forever. So that is the promise. But today's sermon's a little different, particularly in this context, and I don't know how it's going to work, so if it doesn't work, please forgive me and do come back next week. But it's a bit teachy. I want us to think together about what it is, what the Psalms are. And so before we dive into an individual Psalm, we get the chance to sit back a little bit and ask the question, what is this book of the Psalms? The largest singular book in the Bible, probably the easiest found, because if you split your Bible right in the middle, the chances are it's going to open at the book of Psalms. And then you can find your numbered one. It's one of the more simple things like that. But what was the book of Psalms? It was the Hebrew prayer book. It was the Hebrew songbook. It was what they used in order to worship God in all sorts of ways. But it's not simply one book. It's actually divided among itself into 5 books. So book 1 goes from Psalm 1 to 41, 2 from 42 to 72, 3 from 73 up to 89, and then book 4 is 90 to 106, and then book 5 is Psalms 107 to 150. But it wasn't also just written by one author. In fact, one of the things that we discover as we begin to look at the Psalms is we'll see that lots and lots of them are attributed to David. And lots of people just therefore assume that David wrote them all, but he didn't. There were many, many authors of this. Some of them named, some of them not named. And even the ones that are named for David, it's not entirely clear whether these were Psalms about David or Psalms written by David. So there's a bit of confusion about who has written all of these Psalms. And then the timeline is the other important thing I think we need to recognize here, is that the oldest Psalm, or the time difference between the oldest Psalm being written and the newest Psalm being written, is about 1,000 years. These were Psalms that were tried and tested. These weren't just like some guy that sat down with his guitar in the back of a fag paper and scribbled some words down and said, they'll do. Not that I'm suggesting any of our current worship songs you understand or anything like that, but we definitely know the Psalms were something that we put energy and effort into. And so we've got this kind of construction of the book of Psalms, but I want us to recognize too that in the poetic way they're put together, there are lots of different types of psalms. Not only are they organized structurally in different ways, but there are different types of psalms. So among those types, and this is not a conclusive list, but the main ones are psalms of lament, psalms of thanksgiving, psalms of enthronement, psalms of pilgrimage, psalms of royal kingship, psalms of imprecatory cursing. We will do at least one of them, but they are very confusing, I'll confess. And then Psalms of wisdom. It's really diverse what we discover in the book of Psalms. And actually I read this week somebody describing it as a bit like a box of Lego. Now you don't get this anymore, because all you kids, if there's any kids listening today, you buy a Lego and you buy a Lego box and it comes and it's a full kit to build some fancy Star Wars thing or some other stuff like that. But in actual fact, when I was a kid, Lego came in boxes, and you just had loads of different shaped blocks and different colours, and they all ended up in one big box, and then you could use them to build a house or whatever. But it would never all look the same. And I think many of us think of the book of Psalms like a box of Lego. We've got blocks of 4 and blocks of 2. We've got thin ones and skinny ones. We've got red ones and yellow ones. We've got blue ones and white ones. And so depending on how we feel, we sometimes dip in and pull out an individual block and say, right, this one will do for today and that one will do for another day. But we then miss the fact that actually the Psalms are really built together, and that if we start stripping them away individually from their wider meaning, then we begin to lose something of what they are. We can forget that they were carefully composed. We can forget that they were for special occasions. We can forget that they followed established patterns and rhythms. We can forget that actually they were performed. Many of these were for general worship services, but others were for very special circumstances where one person would call out and carry on the message. So there's a performative aspect to the Psalms that we must not miss either. So that's the book of Psalms. Simple as that. That's it all. Easy. Now you all understand. But I want us to come at the book of Psalms from a slightly different direction than just simply saying, well, that's what the book of Psalms is, and this is how we read it. There's a theologian by the name of Walter Brueggemann, who I have found at times in my Christian life both incredibly frustrating and incredibly helpful. But on the book of Psalms, he is, I think, profoundly helpful. And he proposes a way of reading the Psalms that isn't perfect, because there is no such thing as a perfect way of reading the Psalms. But he talks about a way of reading the Psalms that uses three big words. So you'll have to excuse me for using these words. I'll explain what they mean as we go through this morning. So he uses these three words: orientation, disorientation, and reorientation. That's orientation, disorientation, and reorientation. And he suggests this outline not as a straitjacket, but rather as a means of us engaging more meaningfully with the Psalms throughout our experience of life. I think it is both a pastoral approach to the Psalms. In other words, we get to bring our whole lives to the book, not just our happy bits. But also I think it's prophetic, in that it speaks far beyond just our own personal pastoral needs. In fact, Brueggemann himself suggests that there's something subversive in this way of reading the Psalms, because it forces us to confront realities which we would rather ignore, both privately and publicly. And we'll say more about that in the weeks ahead. But there is something about this cultural piece that will resist us, particularly as we talk about disorientation and reorientation at all costs. Because if we are kept in a place of dissatisfaction, it means that we can be sold stuff. You see, you only buy things because you think you need them. It means that we can become people who are nothing more than consumers to a world that is desperate to sell things. And then we find ourselves in this particular moment, and suddenly we go, that's not enough. I know I am more than a consumer. I know I deserve to be thought of differently than that. And the Psalms begin to speak to us. And so why are we doing this series now? Well, I think there are three reasons. One is because we learn to pray. The German martyr Dietrich Bonhoeffer said this: the more deeply we grow into the Psalms and the more often we pray them as our own, the more simple and rich will our prayer life become. If you want to learn to pray, pick up the book of Psalms and just start praying the words you find there. It's profoundly helpful. Bonhoeffer has found that, and Christians throughout the ages have discovered exactly the same thing. So I want us to do this series because I want us to learn to pray. Surely, if God is asking us to do anything in this moment, it is to use some of this new time we have in order to pray. The second reason I want us to do this is I want us to be able to express our full range of emotions. It is simply not acceptable in this moment for us to pretend that everything's okay. And yet there are brands of Christianity that have done that for decades, for centuries, that have built a whole theology around the fact, well, it's all okay, God's in control, you don't need to worry about it at all. In fact, you worrying is sinful. Rubbish. It's never been true. And the Psalms in particular will help us to see just how untrue that is. And then the final reason is because I think in the Psalms we get to worship and encounter Jesus and God in profound ways. C.S. Lewis said, the most valuable thing the Psalms do for me is to express the same delight in God which made David dance. So my hope is that not only will we get you joining in with the singing on a Sunday morning, we might even have some dancing going on. That would be fun. So yes, so that's why I want us to do this series. So quickly this morning, he said, hopefully, we're going to go through what is this orientation, what is this disorientation, and what is this reorientation. Orientation. These are psalms that describe when all is well with the world, when we are at peace, when we can see the world in all of its splendor and see God with clarity. Let me ask you to imagine something with me. Imagine a walk along Porty Beach, along the promenade at sunrise. There's a gentle breeze blowing in off the water. There's some bird song in the air. You've got that clear view of Fife and all the way down to North Berwick. There's a gentle sound of water on the shore. The flatness of the water reflects the orange glow of the sun coming up in the east. This is what it is to be oriented. We begin to understand in that moment what our first psalm was. When I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you've set in place, what is mankind that you are mindful of them? Human beings that you care for them. In that moment on that beach, in that sense of understanding who we are, this is orientation. We get it. We know who God is. We know that God knows who we are. And it brings humility, as David expresses in Psalm 8, and it brings worship also. That is orientation. That place of just being at peace. I know God, He knows me, all is well with the world. That is a beautiful place to be. But life is not always that way. In fact, I would go as far as to say, life is not often that way. We know that it's painful to live in this world, especially in this moment. And so we have disorientation. Things come along that cause us to be disoriented. These can be lots of different things. It could be personal sin, and we see psalms about that. It could be circumstances. We can see psalms about that. It could be the sin of others. We see psalms of that. And of course, it could be a pandemic. It's caused us a moment of great disorientation. And what we mean by that is not just that we're in a bit of a headspin, but particularly in this context, it's that we are disoriented in our relationships with God, with others, with ourselves, and with the world around us. In these moments of disorientation, we have to learn to walk not by what we see, but by faith. It's in these seasons that our faith matters most, does it not? That's difficult and painful, and it is not easy. So please, if you think I'm overly skimming over just how easy disorientation is, I'm not doing that. It's very, very difficult to live in this space. But the Psalms are our guide. They're full of opportunities to corporately and privately express our pain, our anger, our hurt, our depression, our anxiety, our questions and our doubt to God. By the rivers of Babylon, we sat and wept when we remembered Zion. There's no attempt to hide that this is not a moment for joyful singing in Psalm 137. It's a moment to weep. Because all is not well with the world. There is a disorientation there. They're not a shortcut, though. This isn't a case of, well, let's embrace a few of these psalms of disorientation and then actually all will come good and we'll come to our senses and things will be fine. No. Actually, for some people, this experience of disorientation can take weeks and months and even sometimes years to journey through. But what I want us to realize, and to hark back to what I was saying in my little pastoral note, is that we shouldn't rush past this because the Psalms don't. God doesn't. But we get to be the church here. We get to be the people who say pain is okay, struggle is okay, doubt is okay. Just don't isolate yourself. Allow others in. Walk in faith together through this. Now, if you're asked to be someone who comes into that space where someone is walking in disorientation, you don't get to be Bob the Bible man with an answer for everything. That's not your point. You come and you sit. You be present. You journey with. You read the Psalms together. You allow the other person to pour out the fullness of their complaint before God, to recognize their disorientation, but to allow them to know they don't journey alone. And so we will journey through this disorientation where all of life is turned upside down, and the suppositions that we have and the ways that we think the world should be, and we recognize suddenly it's not. All of these things will come together. But the good news for the Christian, you see, is that disorientation is not the final movement. The final word actually is reorientation. In Psalm 124, in 2, 6 and 8, it says this: if the Lord had not been on our side when people attacked us, they would have swallowed us alive. But praise be to the Lord, our help is in the name of the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. See, out of this disorientation comes this moment of reorientation. The joy of release, the worship that comes forth, the recognition of how the world really is, of who is ultimately in control, not as some kind of exercise in getting everything squared away so that the water's flat at Porty Beach and it's just at sunset and it's a sunrise and it's a beautiful sunrise and the breeze is just gentle. It's not about that anymore, because as you've journeyed through disorientation, all your presuppositions of what beauty is have been turned on their head. All your presuppositions of what justice is have been turned on their head, and we journey back into this place of knowing God is in control with a whole lot more knowledge of what the world is really like and what God is really about. It's fundamentally important, though, to recognize that we don't earn the reorientation. It does not come to us because we did X, Y, and Z, that we read all the Psalms, that we read the entire New Testament, that we grabbed hold of Jesus at the cross. The things we do don't matter. Reorientation comes to you and to I as grace, as a gift. This is the salvation moment, the one that we couldn't make happen, and the one that happens over and over and over again in our lives. I want to give you one example from the New Testament of how this worked out in one person's life, and then I'm finished. I've spoken longer than I intended to. Thank you for your grace. Nobody seems to have left the call, at least not officially, so that's good news. The life of Peter. Peter, Jesus' follower, his disciple, his apostle, the one who Jesus called to say, on this little rock I will build the church. This is what happened to Peter. In Luke chapter 9, Jesus turns to Peter and says, who do you say I am? All these people have been saying, oh, you're this, you're that, you're the other. And Jesus turns and looks straight to Peter and says, who do you say I am? And Peter, in a clear-eyed moment of orientation, says, you are God's Messiah. He saw the beauty in front of him. All was well with the world. You are the Messiah. We skip forward in the story. Matthew 26. Jesus has been put on trial and convicted. You were also with Jesus of Galilee, says a woman to Peter. Peter's reply, I don't know what you're talking about. And just at that moment, a rooster crows 3 times. In John's Gospel, it says he ran away weeping. In that moment, a moment of disorientation, a life turned upside down. What is all of this about? And then John 21 that Lewis read for us. Out fishing. And Jesus says, come ashore, bring all these fish I'm going to give you to catch. Bring some of them that we might have breakfast together. And then they go for a walk. And the 3 times that he betrayed him, Jesus says to Peter, do you love me? Feed my sheep, feed my lambs. It arrives as a gift of grace. Peter didn't earn that. 3 times. I love it. It was just, it's so gentle and peaceful. And then Jesus says, follow me, in the full meaning of what that means to Peter, which will be his death just like Jesus. But Peter then leaves that with a whole new understanding of how the world really is and what is going to happen. Orientation, disorientation, and reorientation. This is the journey we're going to go on together, brothers and sisters, as the Church Portobello, as we experience this disorientation of what we go on just now. We're going to find this in the Psalms, and we're going to encourage one another with it. This is how Walter Brueggemann's scheme plays out in real life. And I hope and pray that as we journey through the Psalms, we will see together ways in which we might be a reoriented people as we journey together through this moment of profound disorientation.